thanks for joining us today, Anthony. We know you've got probably a lot of people trying to get hold of you at the moment. There's a lot of things happening. Last Friday, Gladys Berejiklian, the Premier of New South Wales, resigned as Premier. She also resigned as a state MP. And her announcement followed news that the New South Wales Independent Commission Against Corruption was going to be investigating her involvement in relation to some activities with her former partner, Darryl Maguire. Since then, 2 further state MPs have also resigned, including the New South Wales Deputy Premier, John Barilaro. And the public is understandably confused and distressed about all this instability in the middle of a pandemic. So we've got a few questions that we're hoping to ask you just to get a bit of clarity around what's going on and what it means as well in relation to the calls for the federal ICAC.
The questions are really around the processes, governance and accountability of the New South Wales ICAC to start with, and particularly around the timing of its decision to investigate the Premier and the timing of the announcement of that investigation. There's been a very strong reaction to her resignation, and that is creating a risk of a backlash against ICACs in general. And in fact, there's a change.org petition calling for her reinstatement, which already has around 50,000 signatures. So there are some strong views about this and some concerns that the timing of the announcement may have been politically motivated or lacked probity due to the current situation we're in regards to the pandemic. Are those concerns valid? For example, in relation to the New South Wales ICAC investigation, was work generally at ICAC on hold during the pandemic? And if it was it right for them to recommence it at this time?
Yes, I believe it was perfectly appropriate to do what's been done at the present time. But can I just put it into context first? It's not as if this is a bolt out of the blue. I mean, this investigation has been going on for nearly 2 years now. However, as at last October, when it was revealed in a public hearing that the Premier had a secret relationship with a very dodgy character called Darryl Maguire, it became apparent that this investigation might go further. And since that time, I would assume, without knowing precisely, that quite a lot of investigatory work has been done. It's well known that interviews have been going on. And secondly, it's also well known, it's on the public record, that a number of senior bureaucrats in the New South Wales government and a couple of ministers have been interviewed by ICAC during the last, I'd say the last 4 or 5 months. So the investigation's been ongoing. But you're quite right, the pandemic has meant that ICAC has not been able to hold any public hearings. I mean, it could hold public hearings entirely by Zoom, but I think the decision was taken that it would be undesirable to do that in this matter. And I can understand why that's so. I mean, once you're dealing with the Premier of New South Wales, you know, it's very important to make sure that absolute procedural fairness is given to her. And so I think that, while I don't know it, I think that two things emerged to my mind. One, that the investigations have now completed and all private hearings have taken place to such an extent that ICAC is now satisfied that there are some questions that the Premier has to answer. And that's the reason why they have revealed to her and to the public that she is now the focus of an investigation. Now, procedural fairness requires that she be told that, and also the precise nature of the matters that are of concern to ICAC. If they didn't do that, then they would have failed at the outset to give her procedural fairness. And secondly, they need to give her that notice at the very first opportunity. Now, you could have an argument to say, well, why don't they just give her notice but not tell anyone else? But that would be, you know, from every practical perspective, quite an impossible situation. What would she do, for example, if she knew she was the subject of the investigation, and she knew there was going to be a public hearing soon or at some stage, but she continued without revealing that to anyone. And she would have to do that. She'd have to not reveal it to anyone unless she had ICAC's permission to do so. So that's all an intolerable position. So it had to be made public. The second reason it had to be made public is there's going to be a public hearing. So people have to be given notice that there's going to be a public hearing. You can't have a public hearing without telling the public that there is going to be a public hearing. So I think that the answer to your question really is, I know of no reason to suggest other than that ICAC has done this at the first available opportunity once their investigation is completed. And I think that's the correct thing for them to do. It would be quite wrong of them to say, ring up the person under investigation and say, well, look, when would you like us to announce this? When would it suit you for us to announce? Shall we do it, say, after the fireworks on New Year's Eve? Would that make it easier for you?
Is it possible that they could have done this earlier? I mean, has it
finished their investigation?
A bit of criticism about the amount of time it's taken them, given that these revelations happened last October, and it's now a year on, and we're in the middle of a very severe stage of the pandemic. So there's been, some people have been saying, why now? Why not earlier?
Well, 12 months ago, there was no evidence at all to suggest that there would be any investigation into Gladys Berejiklian as the focus of the investigation. It was all into Maguire, but the revelation of her involvement with Maguire obviously meant that there would now commence a more precise investigation into what she knew about Maguire's dealings. And that's one of the questions here that's in the notice given to her. Bear in mind, there are kind of two areas. The first is that it's suggested that she may not have reported Maguire's corrupt conduct, even though she knew about it. It was her obligation under the legislation, as it is for any public servant, to report any information about corrupt conduct directly to ICAC. Now, if she knew about these things and didn't do it, then that would be a serious matter. The second matter that's under investigation is her role in the approval of the very large grants of money that were made to the Wagga electorate when he was the member for Wagga. And the correspondence that I have seen, and it's been made public through the 730 report, is that Darryl Maguire wrote to the Premier and said, "Dear Premier, I want to get your approval for a grant of $5 million or whatever it was for the Clay Shooting Association." And she wrote back and said, "Dear Mr. Maguire, I'll pass that on to the Minister for Sports and Tourism, and he'll get back to you." Now, this is at the same time that they're having a close personal relationship. So that would have raised eyebrows. And then shortly after that, feasibility was studied. A study was done on the project, which came up short. And there was correspondence and evidence to suggest that the Premier then lent on them to redo the estimates. And in their revised estimate, the project was found to meet all requirements for a grant being given. The third thing that happened was that a meeting of the relevant committee with the Treasurer as chairperson of that committee was held when the grant was approved. So, and then later on, when it was proving a bit slow for the money to come out, a number of people in the Premier's department wrote to other people in the sports department and tourism department and said, "Can't we get a move on with this? The Premier is very anxious to push this through as quickly as possible." So that's the kind of background that's been investigated since last year. Now, I can't explain why it's taken so long, but I don't know that it's all that easy to do these investigations. I heard Geoffrey Watson talking this morning, and he used to work with ICAC as counsel assisting. He'd know more about it than I would. And he says that it's quite a lengthy process. They have to prepare notices to produce. People take their time in answering those notices. The documents have to be scrutinised. It often leads to another notice to produce being given. So by the time all the documentation's compiled, it's then necessary to interview all the witnesses to see whether they can provide further information and so on. So look, this is a very long-winded answer, but it's a way of saying that the investigation, I would think that it's taken 12 months to get to this stage, is not something to be necessarily criticised. I mean, bear in mind, ICAC's funding has been decreased substantially, and they're through the present government in New South Wales. And in that situation, a lot of their capabilities have been reduced. So maybe that has something to do with it. And then, of course, there's the pandemic. Everyone's working from home. No one's working in the office. So I don't think you can criticise them really for the fact that it's taken 12 months. But don't you think that it's kind of contrary to be saying, oh, why did it take so long? And then to say, well, why did they announce it now? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. You announce it as soon as you can. There may be an argument to say, well, should you announce it? And now when we're in the middle of a pandemic, but I don't think that question, although it's very understandable why people would think that, but they were not intending in announcing this that the Premier should resign. They would no doubt think that she'd possibly step aside, but the rest of the government would still be there. We've got tremendous ministers in New South Wales and tremendous public servants, particularly in the health department, who would make sure everything would continue as before. We just wouldn't have Gladys's 11 a.m. conferences. So really, to be serious, I just don't see myself that there's any substance in that argument. I think it'd be quite improper for ICAC to say effectively, well, let's suit the convenience of the person we're going to investigate.
Has the ICAC been, so I know it sounds like it's been pared back through the pandemic, people have been working from home, but they've still been doing their work, right? They didn't suspend their work generally because of the pandemic.
No, I don't know. I mean, I'm not there, but I would assume, like every other organisation, they've been able to continue with their work, but I think the pandemic has probably slowed things down a bit. And secondly, as I say, the investigatory process is not easy. Say you've got 30 people to interview, and I imagine there would be about at least 30 people who would have to be interviewed over all this. All the people down in Wagga, all of the bureaucrats in the public service who had something to do with these grants, and also the ministers who've had something to do with these grants, or their chief of staffs. They'd all have to be interviewed. And sometimes when people are interviewed, they don't like to say much. And that leads to what's called a compulsory private examination. So that's a different process again, and a very slow one, because you have to give people summonses to attend. It's a secret affair. They're not allowed to reveal they've been examined. And it's like a little courtroom scene. They're actually cross-examined, and they have to answer even if the answers tend to incriminate them. And as I say, I wouldn't be surprised if the Premier herself has been the subject of a compulsory examination, because that's how ICAC works. And I don't know if people understand it. They have...
Well, I might just... That's a very good point. I don't think people do understand how it works, and there's been a lot of backlash against the ICAC the last few days. I mean, the next question we've got is about the process. So, you know, what process does the ICAC need to follow, particularly before making a decision to investigate? So, do the normal rules of evidence apply in relation to the trigger points for an investigation? Does the New South Wales ICAC need evidence of corruption in order to commence an investigation? So, what does it look like from within the ICAC? How do they make the decision that they're going to investigate?
Fair question. All right, look, I'll give you an example. Last year, because I've made a bit of a study of this, last year ICAC had 2,495 complaints lodged with it. So those complaints were about 48% from the public, about 36% from other departments, and then a lot of others from anonymous complainants, whistleblowers within a department rather than the department itself, and so on. So over 2,400 complaints have to be scrutinised, they have to be weeded out, and then there are preliminary investigations of each and every one of them that look like they have some substance to them, and the determination is made as to whether they can be referred back to the department from which they emerged to be dealt with at an internal level. So you think about all the time that's involved and the processes that are involved there in dividing them up into categories and trying to work out if there are any really serious corruption matters that require a full-on investigation. And in this year that I've just described, ultimately, there were only 9 matters that they thought required further and full investigation. It would have taken them many months to come to that point, and there would have been many people working within ICAC to get to that point. I mean, there are about 5 divisions of ICAC within ICAC. They've got hundreds of people who work there, and they have different tasks to perform. But finally, they were able to come out with 9 matters that required full-on investigation. And then they had more than 30 private compulsory hearings, and then 3 only public hearings. So you can see that by the time this focuses down to a public hearing, funnels down to a public hearing, there's been a massive amount of work and process in determining whether the matter should be fully investigated. And secondly, and importantly, is it in the public interest to have a public hearing? Now, even at that point, I want to stress this, the legislation has very stringent tests that have to be applied to determine whether something's in the public interest so as to hold a public hearing. I won't go through everything, but the important things are the nature of the conduct that is said to be involved, the magnitude of the possible corrupt conduct that's involved, the impact it would have on public confidence if it were found to be correct. And on the other hand, you have to look at the damage to reputation that might be unfairly caused by holding a public hearing. And you're drawing all these things together, and you've got to make a balanced decision about whether to have a public hearing. And sometimes in these cases, there is no public hearing. In other cases, there is. But I think given the importance and the public nature of the Darryl Maguire investigation, and then the importance of the possible involvement of the Premier and the position of the Premier as the head of the state, I mean, how could you not have a public hearing? So to answer your question, how do they actually determine it? What tests do they apply? Well, they don't apply the laws of evidence as such. I mean, they're looking at facts. They're not bound by the laws of evidence in coming to a conclusion, I should rephrase that. They are not bound by the laws of evidence in conducting their hearings, whether private or public. So, but they do it.
But it's not. Sorry, Anthony. Sorry, carry on. I've just interrupted you.
They do have to abide by the rules of procedural fairness. And then when they just have to make a decision about something, they have to apply, the common or the civil law test of the balance of probabilities, not beyond a reasonable doubt.
So it's not just a question of they receive an allegation and like free rein, let's just go for this person.
I hope what I've said makes it clear that when they get any allegation, it's thoroughly looked at. Sometimes they can be just discarded out of hand. Other times they've got to be looked at a bit more carefully. It's got to be passed around within the, I'll say within the office amongst the various divisions in ICAC, including the intelligence section, to see whether there's any possible substance to it. More often than not, the great majority of matters are cast aside ultimately and nothing happens. But there are left then a handful of matters which are then scrutinised very carefully, and it's decided that it will be necessary to obtain compulsory private hearings to see whether the evidence is there to warrant the matter then going to a full investigation. Once it gets to that stage, not only the Act, but procedural fairness requires that any person who's going to be affected by it needs to be given notice of whether the investigation focuses on their behaviour or not.
Okay, we might move on to the next point that's sort of raising itself, which is about political interference in the ICAC. So there's been this question around the timing, but also
why do you say that it could be political interference about the timing? Because the timing's hopeless. If you wanted to do something from a political perspective, you wouldn't have issued her with a notice when she's just about to come out victorious. That'll be the worst bit of politics I've ever heard.
I guess it depends who it is who's trying to interfere. But just on the political interference question, because we are putting to you questions that are being raised in public forums. These are obviously not our views. We are simply putting up ideas to see if they have any merit. The idea that this body could be used for political purposes, I know that you've mentioned the chair of ICAC, but personalities aside, there would obviously need to be more concrete checks and balances other than the personality of the person in the job. Can you just outline what those would be to avoid this being subject to political interference?
Well, the activities of ICAC are always supervised quite strictly by an inspector of ICAC who's appointed by the government of the day for usually a 5-year term. And his job is to scrutinise every activity of ICAC and also to receive any complaints at all about any of its behaviour and to investigate those and to write a public report and to appear before Parliament as required. So the position of the inspector is a terrifically important one. I remember when I was in ICAC, or just shortly after I'd finished, the matter of Margaret Cunneen began, or at least it was being thought about within ICAC. And the inspector at the time was David Levine, and he became incensed about the whole thing and wrote letters immediately to say he wanted to be versed about every decision to be made in the Cunneen matter because he was convinced this wasn't a proper matter for ICAC to be dealing with. And it was a very hostile period of time between ICAC and its inspector. And that's not a bad thing. You know, that's what we want: supervision, oversight, and an inspector who takes an interest. The current inspector of ICAC is Bruce McClintock, who's, you probably know him as a famed defamation lawyer. He appears for everyone at the highest end in defamation matters, and he's a very senior QC. And he takes a great interest in ICAC, and he's no fool. Now then, in addition to the inspector, there's also a parliamentary committee that meets regularly. It's generally quite hostile to ICAC. It's not friendly to ICAC. It is multi-party, so you get a bit of a mixed bag up there in these committee hearings, but nevertheless, there is a committee there and its job is to supervise. The third area is that if ICAC makes a decision that is contrary to law, or if it takes into account matters it shouldn't have taken into account, or if it ignores matters that it should take into account, then there are administrative law appeals that can be brought to the Supreme Court. So, you know, I think that there's plenty of oversight and supervision of ICAC there. And if there's been anything, you know, contrary to law in the timing of this, or any ulterior motive, you know, such as a political piece of opportunism, then it will be supervised by those authorities. They won't ignore it. And given all the publicity, they'll be very keen to scrutinise it. And you see that happening all around Australia with other ICACs as well. You know, at the moment in the Northern Territory, there's a big kerfuffle going on. In Queensland, there's a big kerfuffle going on. And in South Australia, there's a big kerfuffle going on. And so there should be. I mean, that's the whole point. These bodies should be scrutinised, and there should be proper oversight. And if things go off the rails, then it should be brought to the public's attention. No doubt about that at all.
Those processes that you've just outlined and those checks and balances and the governance of the process, is that all publicly available? Can people avail themselves of that information?
You can write, you and I could write to Bruce McClintock today to say, we are very concerned about this. How do we know this isn't a political, the Premier's been made a political scapegoat we'd ask him to look at it, and he'd be obliged to, because he might look at it and say there's no evidence to support that proposition. He might say that. On the other hand, he might be concerned and say, well, I'm going to write to the Commissioner of ICAC and I'm going to demand that I get a full explanation for why it's been done at this point of time. He'd be entitled to do that. And then when he gets the information that he needs, he would then be obliged to write a public report. And that report would be not only available to the public, it would also go to Parliament as well.
Mm-hmm.
Should we move on to the questions about what's happened in South Australia? In South Australia, the ICAC's just recently had its powers reined in by the Parliament down there. Is that something that could happen here because of what's happened with this investigation, do you think?
Well, I suppose you could say the Parliament has the power to do anything it likes, so far as legislation is concerned. However, I think the situation in South Australia was quite extraordinary because the legislature went through both houses of Parliament, upper and lower, in 12 hours with no debate. A committee of inquiry was set up to examine the case of these policemen who had been found to be acting dishonestly, but who were then acquitted. And the committee made some 15 recommendations. I may be wrong about the number, it could have been 15 or 20, but a number of recommendations, and some of them were very good as to the way in which ICAC in South Australia could be improved in its performance. But what happened was a crusading member of Parliament, Mr. Frank Pangallo, who was a former journalist, brought his own private member's bill into Parliament a couple of weeks ago, and he demanded that Parliament here debate on it and rush it through Parliament. There wasn't much debate, but eventually, with a bit of argy-bargy and a few amendments, it went through. And the areas in which it has now decimated South Australia's Corruption Commission are very significant, and they are not part of the recommendations in the committee's list of recommendations. They're ones dreamed up by Mr. Pangallo, and they have really done damage to ICAC. So what you had was a genuine case that required careful thinking, and if it required revisions to ICAC, no one would have complained about that at all. And the present Commissioner of ICAC, who's only been there about a year, she agrees with that. She said, look, I would have been very happy to discuss these recommendations and possibly approve of a number of them. But the recommendations that have gone through now are not those ones, and they have deprived me of my ability to uncover corruption amongst politicians in Parliament in South Australia. And bear in mind that there are 4 inquiries going on at the moment involving Liberal parliamentarians in South Australia, and it looks like they will be stymied because of these changes. So that's South Australia. It's quite complicated, but you could sum it up by saying bad cases make hard law. There was something that happened there a few years ago that everybody's concerned about. All right, let's do something about it, but not this. This is an overreaction. And to think that this was a measured passage of a bill through Parliament is wrong. It went through in 12 hours without debate. And if you go onto all of the media reports in South Australia, you'll see just how bad it is. And the present Commissioner Anne Vanstone, who's a very respected woman and a former Supreme Court judge over there in South Australia, she's horrified what's happened. Go on the ABC and look up Anne Vanstone and ICAC, and you'll hear a half-hour commentary by her on what these changes have done to her position and how they've destroyed her ability to uncover corruption among public servants and politicians.
And there's another question there about, has that bill being rushed through Parliament without debate, is that in the public interest? Now that you've got this situation where the ICAC's been in South Australia has been decimated, arguably that's not in the public interest, or it's not going to produce the right outcomes. And just bringing it back to New South Wales, the next Premier is going to be Dominic Perrottet. do you have any thoughts or ideas about whether he might be looking to water down the powers of the New South Wales ICAC?
You can perhaps get a clue from what Brad Hazzard said yesterday during his morning interview, where he raised this idea about maybe we shouldn't have public hearings. So I wouldn't think there'd be any major changes, but there might be, again, a debate about whether public hearings are good or bad. That's a fair debate, but gosh, we've had it so many times now.
Do you think that stems from a lack of understanding that there has been so much work done behind the scenes and the private examinations, and that there is this public interest test that applies before a public hearing is announced?
I'm sure that's so. I mean, all the public know is the Premier comes out in a very sympathetic speech, very eloquent and sad. She resigns. And so people say, what's going on here? So, yes, they don't know all the things. And I think that if they did know them, they'd still feel a great deal of sympathy for the Premier. Other politicians, maybe not so, if it happened to them, but she's in a prime position of public support and popularity. I don't think I've ever known a politician who garnered such support. But nevertheless, I keep saying that, she, like all others, has to be accountable for her actions. And if upon investigation she's found to have fallen short, well, that has to be the way it is. We can't allow popularity to win the battle over accountability, transparency and integrity.
Which is something that, Delia and I and others talk about a lot, and it's really been quite shocking for us actually to see the extent of the public reaction to the fact that Gladys Berejiklian is being investigated for potentially being involved in corrupt activities or not reporting corrupt activities, and that to us is what's is the facts of what's happening here. But the public reaction has been so overwhelmingly strong that it's in favour of her being reinstated, for example, or that she's been treated unfairly, without really any kind of consideration, it would seem, of the fact that the investigation that she's subjected to now is about some very serious allegations. So it's quite a strange time for those of us who've been watching closely what's going on to reconcile those things.
I would add to that there may be a lot of discussion on Twitter, and we've seen a lot of discussion on LinkedIn, and there are comments going either way. So it's certainly not that we have polled people in Wentworth and that they overwhelmingly feel that she should be reinstated. That's not the case at all. It's just that there's a lot of vocal people who are hitting social media who are expressing support for her and who are raising concerns about the process. So, which is why, we're having this discussion. I wanted to ask a question about the way that the New South Wales ICAC is run and its processes compared to the model that Helen Haines has put forward for a federal integrity commission. Are they essentially similar in most ways, or are there differences between them?
I think they're essentially similar. I think Helen's also concerned about public hearings, and I think she would, in her heart of hearts, think that we shouldn't get rid of public hearings, but we should only have them when it is absolutely necessary to do so. The New South Wales ICAC doesn't disagree with that under its present leadership. I'd say if you went back 10 years to when David Ip was the commissioner and when Geoffrey Watson was counsel assisting, there was a feeling then that they were having too many public hearings, and that public hearings were being used as a public spectacle kind of media circus. And I think there was some truth in that. Now, I think you don't see many public hearings at all. I mean, recently, only as recently as last week, there was a public hearing in ICAC. And it was another politician. There wasn't much fuss about it at all. I don't think there's essentially a difference between Helen Haines' ICAC and the New South Wales one. There may be around the edges. There's greater protection for whistleblowers, for example. The creation of an integrity commissioner who would operate sort of a parliamentary integrity commissioner, which doesn't happen in ICAC. But otherwise, there's a lot of similarities there. There are New South Wales ICAC, I didn't mention this before, has guidelines for public hearings now that it didn't have 10 years ago. And these are designed to give fairness to a witness. So the witness is entitled to have legal representation at all times, even if they can't afford it. Secondly, if ICAC has material that tends to help the position of a witness who's being examined, they call it exculpatory material, a big word for meaning things that show they haven't done anything wrong, then ICAC's bound to bring that to their attention and their lawyers' attention before the public hearing. So that's a big improvement on a very secretive way ICAC used to conduct itself 10 years ago. And there are other guidelines there all designed to achieve procedural fairness. I think Helen Haynes would think all of those were very useful things for her own model to incorporate. But I do think it's interesting that last week we had a very public stoush. No one said a word about that. No one said, "Oh, what's wrong with ICAC and its processes? And did they give him notice? And why did they do it now?" You know, no one said a word about it. But there you are. That's your popular Premier, loved by people on both sides, and so you just got to wear it. I think. I mean, you've got to answer all these things that are said, and sift out the genuine concerns and answer them, and ignore the ones that are foolish and over the top. I don't think it should, you know, my feeling is I don't think that Voices of Wentworth should have any fear in promoting a federal ICAC with teeth. I think that at the same time, Voices of Wentworth should say, of course, we want it to have all possible protections and all proper oversight so that people's reputation not unfairly damaged, but we want it to be effective. You can't have it both ways. That's what the government's model is. It's a model that will not enable you to scrutinise politicians. So you won't get any damaged reputations. That part of it's good, but you won't get anyone found to be guilty of corrupt conduct either. So, you know.
Sort of where we are now.
That's exactly where we are.
We know that there's strong support in Wentworth and around the country as well for a federal ICAC. But it's interesting to see this public sort of backlash that's happening against the New South Wales ICAC, and we've had Barnaby Joyce this morning comparing it to the Spanish Inquisition. You know, we're expecting there to be some federal MPs and their supporters pushing back on the calls for a federal ICAC based on the public backlash against the New South Wales ICAC.
Oh my.
Yeah, so I guess that's one of the reasons we wanted to have this conversation with you, to fully understand the process of the New South Wales ICAC and the potential problems with it and the criticisms of it and how those can be addressed.
Yeah, all right. Well, I think the answer is, look, if there are any justifiable criticisms of New South Wales ICAC, if they can be demonstrated either by, you know, a report from the inspector or some other proper form of oversight rather than just idle gossip, then I think that should be taken into account in the model for a federal ICAC. I don't think there's any doubt about that. So I think the simple answer is, look, we all agree that we don't want to see reputations damaged unfairly. We don't want to see politicians hounded for political reasons. We don't want to see any unfairness in the process, but we do want to uncover corruption. Therefore, in creating a federal model for an ICAC, let us learn the lessons from other ICACs around Australia. And if there are shortcomings in them, by all means, let us learn the lesson and incorporate situation to improve that without impairing the effectiveness of the anti-corruption body. So that's the general response I would make to that. And can I just add that the Labor Party is still committed to its model. Dreyfus hasn't stepped back from his statement that and Albanese that they will support a federal ICAC. The Greens haven't stepped back from it. Helen Haynes hasn't stepped back from it. So at the moment, even though it's going to cause, you know, more than just an irritation in the argument, I don't think it should stop anyone from seeing the value of going ahead with a federal ICAC and And I think this debate will really just sharpen the focus.
It sounds very much like the key message that needs to be pushed a bit more out there so that people are aware is that there is a great deal of work that goes on behind the scenes, a lot of investigative work that happens, private examinations, notices to produce, information gathering, and the public interest test that's applied before anything goes public. So it's not a question of just an accusation is made against somebody and it's then sort of, you know, they're being accused in the public domain. There is a lot more to it than that, and I think that's something that the public needs to perhaps understand.
And I think the other point is that from between now and the time this investigation finishes is the important time, and the public will have an opportunity, because of the fact that it's a public hearing. The public and the people who go on Twitter and write to you will have the opportunity of seeing what happens in ICAC, and they can judge for themselves whether it's fair or not. They can judge whether the process is fair and whether the Premier will be getting a fair run. I think that's very important too. That's another advantage of a public hearing. You know, it enables the public not only to be informed, but to be satisfied that fairness is being provided to those being examined or investigated. Oh, that's so important. You know, Barnaby talks about the Inquisition. They didn't have public hearings in the times of the Spanish Inquisition or the Star Chamber in England. Kath, you'd know that from your history lessons. It was all done behind doors on the rack.
Yeah, I think that was a little bit of an extreme comparison, but there we go. That's Barnaby for you.
At least the rack's in public here, you know.
Delia.
Yeah. So Anthony, in terms outside of the processes and governance of ICAC itself, in terms of Gladys's response as a general integrity question, do you think it is appropriate for a Premier in her situation to step aside during the ICAC investigation? And do you think that it was appropriate that she then resigned her seat?
I think it is appropriate to step aside. That's a standard she herself set for other parliamentarians. I mean, the gentleman I mentioned, who's being publicly examined by ICAC last week, he stepped aside, and Gladys said that in her book that was exactly the right thing to do. So that's the standard she set, and I think she had to do that until the matter was over. I mean, she said herself that she's acted with integrity at all times, so she's got nothing to fear, but standing aside is the right thing to do. But that raises the next question about politics. Politically, I don't know. Politically, did she resign because of political push? Was it because deep down other people wanted her job? I guess we'll never know, will we? But that's certainly what's happened. And you know, Mr. Perrottet looks very pleased with himself at the moment. So I wouldn't mind betting a bit of ambition comes into it as soon as this sort of situation arises. So politics is always present, unfortunately. And I do think, being sympathetic to Gladys, I mean, she was very emotionally upset by all this. And I think at times of great emotional upset, you don't always make the right decision. I think she was unwise to resign. She didn't have to resign. If there's anyone who could survive this inquiry without having to resign, it was Gladys. And people would have been delighted to continue to support her, even if she'd stood aside. The trouble is, I think she probably knows that it's going to take 3 to 6 months for it to be resolved. So maybe that's another factor. She felt that, should I just stand aside and be a nobody for 3 or 6 months? But again, that's a political decision to make as well as a personal one. So to answer your question, yes, she should have stepped aside for the time, but I don't believe she should have resigned, and there was no requirement on her to resign at all. Nothing in ICAC's procedures that required her to resign.
Just to be clear, is there anything in ICAC's procedures that would require her to step aside for the duration?
No, it's not interested in politics, really.
Yeah. Okay. Kath, anything else?
I think we've covered most things. I mean, there were some other questions that I had about the just pointing out some of the issues in the other state ICAC. I think we've covered those.
I can quickly deal with those, Kath. I mean,
yeah, that'd be great. So there was the South Australia one we've talked about. There was also in Victoria, there was an internal survey results which showed that only 49% of staff agreed that they felt confident of being protected from reprisal if they reported improper conduct at work. This is within the Commission. And this response underlined a risk of corruption occurring within the Commission. Do you have any views on that?
well, look, I think it's fair enough. If that's what the survey shows, it means that they've got to do a lot more work to make their employees feel safer and able to report anything that concerns them. I mean, those sort of surveys are valuable, and I think that the ICAC in Victoria has done a terrific job the last few years. It's uncovered some major pieces of corruption in the education department and then in the railways, really major stuff. And they've had public hearings, and no one's uttered a word of complaint about the efficacy of those investigations and their outcomes. So that's a tick for ICAC, a couple of ticks really. But the fact that there's sort of unsteadiness within the workplace is something that can be addressed. I don't think it should reflect upon any of the arguments for a federal ICAC at all.
I mean, where I'm going with this is there's problems in various ICAC models. None of them seem to be perfect. None of them work perfectly. There's obviously room for criticism, but the question I've been asked is, is there a bulletproof model that we can use? I mean, I guess that's what we're sort of aiming for in the federal ICAC model, but is it bulletproof? Will people ever be confident that the right balance has been struck between the wishes of voters and the need for uncovering corruption and upholding public trust in our governments?
Well, there's always a tension between the body seeking to uncover corruption and the parliamentarians who've created it, particularly if the spotlight's turned on them. Anne Vanstone in South Australia said last week in a televised interview that the closer we get to politicians, the more they want to destroy us. And I think that's true. But I mean, the Victorian problem is just a staffing problem, really. It's not. When I say staffing, I mean it's related to staff confidence in their own processes. Every workplace can have that, as we know, particularly in the field of whistleblowing. And there's so much more to be done to protect whistleblowers in every field, including in people who are employed with ICAC. So, you can certainly improve the model in that sense. But the bigger question you've raised, I don't think there's anything in Victoria that should bother us there. Queensland, you've got the same sort of situation. The inquiry in Queensland and an investigation into local councillors resulted in the whole council being sent off for prosecution. And from what I can gather, the prosecutions didn't get anywhere. So that raises this tension that I mentioned about ICAC making findings of inappropriate conduct. And then when there's a prosecution, the prosecution doesn't succeed. But that's being investigated, that matter, by the Parliamentary Oversight Committee at the moment. A good friend of mine, Jonathan Horton QC, is counsel assisting that commission. And he's a fiery little fellow, and they'll get a thorough investigation into that, and there'll be a good and useful report on it. And that's the way it should go. And then, if there's been a failure in process or any other sort of failure, then we will know about it in an official way. So that's a good thing. Northern Territory, there's a bit of a furor going up there at the moment because, you can't get anything more parochial than Darwin and the Northern Territory. So here, the local turf club managed to get a big grant out of the state government to build a new grandstand at the races. It's very Australian, isn't it? Film out of it. And it seems that there was a bit of collusion between the chief of staff in the particular department of government and the bloke who's the chairman of the turf club. And so ICAC investigated that and found they were both guilty of corrupt conduct. And the chairman of the turf club is a big businessman from Darwin. He's not very happy. So he's demanding that the Supreme Court intervene and chuck the book at ICAC up in the Northern Territory. But that's all right. People who get found guilty of corrupt conduct often make a lot of noise. I mean, Eddie O.B. did, and Ian McDonald did, and
We'll talk again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Authorised by D. Burrage, Bondi Junction.